Okay, so welcome to the podcast, Martin, and also welcome to the Doing Diaspora, since we're doing this as a joint initiative. It's really great to have you on here, especially because we've worked together a lot lately, and we've also been corresponding a lot. You've been encouraging me a lot, which is great. And to those listening as well, to those watching, this is both going out on the Migration Podcast and on the Doing Diaspora YouTube series of the Networking Institute. So if you're sick of watching us on YouTube, you can switch to the audio on the podcast. I don't think it works the other way around, but here we go. Anyway, Martin, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, my friend. First of all, thank you for having me on, and well done on the initiative to do it. We're good in Ireland. Quite a traumatic evening last night when it was announced that the pubs won't reopen for another couple of weeks. So bit downbeat today, but we'll get through it.
Okay. Well, I wanted to start with just asking you. Well, actually, first of all, to throw a bit of a curveball out there and to put you on the spot, could you perhaps, for those who aren't aware of what diaspora engagement is, could you perhaps give your overview of what it is, especially for those who are tuning in on Doing Diaspora? I'd like to hope that they've figured out by now what diaspora engagement is, but especially for the Migration Podcast, it would be great for you to just give your overview of that.
Yeah, of course. Look, there's a couple of PhDs in that question, so thanks for the curveball. No, look, from my understanding, it's about engaging communities and their descendants or offsprings or people with an affinity to a certain country that live abroad for a wide range of either ideas or initiatives or for practical or philosophical reasons. So that's how I visualize it in my head. We'll probably come to it a bit later when we talk about maybe some of those subtleties between migration and diaspora. I think diaspora is in many ways, a much more powerful term because it brings in that issues of affinity and belonging that can be kind of quite alienated if you take a very straight migration lens. So that would be my understanding of it. And I'm a reluctant academic at heart. If anybody listening to this wants to reach out and get books on the definition of diaspora, we have a bibliography on it. So I'm happy to lead. People that I've always read throughout the years that have informed my thinking on it quite a bit have been people like Brubeck or Bobach, Cohen, Sheffer, Safran. There's a deep, rich literature there to look at. But again, everybody comes at it from a different lens. But the quick answer is people maybe that have emigrated, looking to engage with them, their kids, or people that have an affinity to your country or city or region or place.
Fantastic, and we'll definitely come back to that because it is quite an interesting question. These definitional questions that come up all the time. And what is it that you do, and what is it that the Networking Institute does?
Well, there's an old saying in Ireland that you keep going till you get caught. So I'll answer first in terms of what I do. Look, I wear many different hats, but in terms of the diaspora space, it traditionally focuses on advising governments or organizations, public or private sector, who want to look at engaging diasporas for a range of reasons, and going in and helping them to kind of shape maybe the ideas or the strategies or the policies to help them enact that. I mentioned kind of briefly earlier, I do have an academic background, so I came at it from a research perspective. So I think that blend of the research with the kind of more strategic side of it is quite unique. In terms of the Networking Institute, we have a broader portfolio of work. So essentially, we're a training company, and we train people and organizations on a couple of key topics. Ironically enough, one of them with my accent is public speaking. But the core focus of the training programs tend to be on networking, philanthropy and fundraising, and diaspora engagement. So that's essentially what the institution does and what I do myself.
Brilliant. And question I think I've always had on my mind, which I haven't directly asked you, is how did you end up working in diaspora engagement? Was this like I don't know, being a Cork man in Dublin, being part of the Cork diaspora? I know you've lived abroad and everything, but it'd be interesting to hear your view on that.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I think that journey point is kind of unique to everybody that works in and around the topic. And I think it's very timely we're having this conversation today. I spent the morning looking at the funeral of John Young, who is a hero of mine in terms of what he's done on the island of Ireland. And that was my entry point to diaspora engagement, looking at the role of the Irish diaspora, particularly Irish America, in the peace process and just kind of peace building more broadly. But I mean, if you want the full nuts and bolts of the answer, first time I went to college, I dropped out. I'm very happy to say that. Very proud of that.
Dropped out or kicked out?
Yeah, yeah, true. But so when I actually went back, I wanted to be a mathematician, believe it or not. So when you talk about kind of ending up on diaspora engagement, like most things in life, it's a little bit of luck, and people probably seeing something in you that you can't see in yourself, and maybe going back the second time, having a bit more maturity to realize that you need to listen to these people rather than be kind of gung-ho in terms of where you want to go. So when I was kind of towards my undergraduate back home in Cork, I was working on a dissertation on the role of collective memory in US foreign policy. And what I quickly realized was that was an incredibly good fit with the diaspora lens that I was trying to figure out in terms of the peace process. So the professor there at the time, Professor David Ryan, was kind enough to recommend me to somebody who has been instrumental in my career, Professor Liam Kennedy at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. And because I wanted to look at the peace process and the role of Irish America, that institution was set up in recognition of the role of President Clinton in the peace process. So it was a perfect fit. So I did the master's, did the PhD there. And again, from there, again, just incredibly lucky to have people, that I work very closely with Kingsley now at the Networking Institute. Kingsley was on the board of that academic institution. So the dots just falling into place at the right time. So did the academic stuff for a bit, did a bit of lecturing, did a bit of research. We were then commissioned by the Irish government to do a bit of work for them. What I quickly realized was, that the academic world, I probably didn't have the maturity or the patience to navigate through that in terms of career development. So I wasn't sure if that was Irish academia or academia more broadly. So I was incredibly lucky to do a short fellowship with Professor Melissa Siegel and the team at the United Nations University in Maastricht. And, so I built those relationships and that kind of career pathway that, allows me to dip my toe back into the academic world now and again if I want, because there's great value in that in terms of not just being able to back up what you try to say in terms of the advice or the services that you provide, but in a learning lesson in life, you have to keep learning. So the chance to learn from these people, I think, is important to hang around with them as much as you can. So that's how we ended up. And when I finished up in Maastricht, when I was I know kind of jumping back in time and calendar, but when I was coming towards the end of the PhD many years ago, Kingsley was moving back to Dublin, and he had put together the Global Diaspora Strategies Toolkit, which was launched at the first Global Diaspora Forum in Washington, DC in 2011, I think. And that was quite well received. So then we began to get a lot of attraction and kind of requests from the people that I mentioned, whether they're government, civil society organizations, private sector organizations, to help them. So that's how I ended up in it. I'm a failed mathematician.
Well, that is fascinating, and it is always interesting to ask different people how they ended up working in this space, and often it is kind of a mixture, I guess, of the various things and serendipity that come up in one's working and personal life, and then also often it's also about one's personal experiences, living abroad, traveling, or for instance, in your case, looking at the Irish peace process and how the diaspora was engaged in that. And because you've had this diverse array of experiences, especially given your academic and practitioner hats that you wear and interchange between, I wanted to ask for your take on, especially because this talk is going out not only on Doing Diaspora but also on the Migration Podcast. I wanted to ask for your take on how diaspora engagement sits within the migration topic as a whole, or perhaps how it doesn't sit or sits uncomfortably, and whether you find there to be any, tensions between talking about migration on the one hand and diaspora engagement on the other.
Yeah, look, I think it's a brilliant question, Loksan, and it's the $1 billion question in many ways. I think if you crack it, you're onto something quite special. And look, I'm going to say a few things that might be provocative and maybe I won't use too many expletives, but maybe annoy a few people.
We'll try not to censor you on the Migration podcast, but and all views are welcome.
No, thank you. Look, I think the way you framed the question was incredibly good, actually, in the sense of where does it sit? And I think if you look historically, diaspora engagement has always been maybe an additional portfolio within wider, whether this is academic or kind of practitioner framework that you're looking at. It's always sat as almost a module within a migration and development nexus or migration and development program or project. It's a bit of a disservice to diaspora engagement, because I think we have to, we may come to it in a moment about where the wider sector of diaspora engagement is, but the only way we're going to grow it and the only way we're going to push it on and bringing some incredibly talented people, young and old, like yourself, is to have confidence in it, to stand on its own 2 feet. So you're getting at that nuance of what is migration and what is diaspora, and ironically enough, we have to be frank and open and honest enough to say to ourselves that, there's not many more toxic words in the dictionary than migration at the moment, either from a public or a policy perspective, in terms of sentiment. And that's the big opportunity I see in backing diaspora on its own. I think diaspora engagement can do a lot of good for migration. And I said this in a podcast for the UN a couple of months ago, but I'll give you a very small example that's very relevant. There's a new Netflix series called Immigration Nation, which is looking at immigration in the US at the moment, and it's quite emotional. It's actually quite horrific when you sit down and watch it. And if I was a member of a diaspora in the US that had been lucky enough to have a bit of success, that would be awakening something in me that would make me want to do something about it. Whether you want to do that at the polls, if you can, or do you want to do that through how you want to strategically back nonprofits or people that are on the front line to helping these people. So I think that's where I see the power of it. And the hidden reality in all this is that because of the public and the policy and the political sentiment being so downward maybe around migration, and I'll come to positivity in a minute because there is some, we've arguably lost the marketing or the media message on migration. So the question now is, how can we win it back? And I think by really focusing on, people that are in many ways migrants, but are part of, they see themselves as a part of diaspora communities, we can create something really powerful now. And coming back to the point about, how I ended up in diaspora engagement, a really additional point to that debate is, why did I stay working on it? Because this is a topic that you're not going to get rich from. Let's be frank. So the reason why I stayed working in it, to be quite frank, is that I've seen these stories, I've met these people, and I've seen this power. And there's very few sectors in today's age with technology and communications that still has people at its core. And I think diaspora engagement is one of them. So coming to the positive side of it, and we might come to it later, so I won't jump the gun, you might want to talk about it. If you look at the doom and gloom of the last couple of months with the global pandemic, some of the real shining lights of positivity and just stories of hope have come from diaspora communities stepping up to help, not just back home, but in their host countries as well. So I think we're at the start of something really special. So that was a long way of saying that migration and diaspora are like first cousins, related but different. But I think there's a lot to unpack there, and if we do it well enough and we do it with a bit of courage, I think then the world can be a better place.
Very well said. I mean, I think you make some really excellent points as usual, and we of course discussed this at length when you interviewed me on Doing Diaspora recently. And I go back and forth on that, on whether or not, or to what extent it's we should try and decouple migration from diaspora, or try and, of course, change the narrative on migration. Because you can use diaspora, as we've said, we can use that in a very positive way, and it also provides a lot of, as we discussed previously, a lot of entry points to talk to discussions about many other topics. And so we can use diaspora and the positivity that it brings and the fluidity of the term to counter some of the negativity surrounding migration. But of course it merits respect as well as a sector, as a field of research on its own, and in a way decoupling them can perhaps help strengthen that body of knowledge and then the thinking around it too, perhaps.
Look, I think that's a good way of looking at it. Look, you strategically decouple it when it's important to do it.
Yeah.
You know, there is a relationship. You can't deny that there's a relationship between migration and diaspora. You know, but one of the things, we just finished an article last week, myself and Kingsley, that's coming out in a book next year on diaspora philanthropy. And one of the things that we wrote is, you know, particularly during the pandemic, you know, diaspora members are walking the halls of Congress, but they're also walking the soup kitchens. You know, and there's very few community layers out there, or maybe kind of aspects of society or civicness out there that have that type of access across the spectrum. You know, and to not be thinking about how do we strategically engage with those layers of your diaspora, and we'll come to this in a moment. You know, you have successful members of the diaspora, you have very vulnerable members of the diaspora. It's about engaging everybody that you can. You know, but there's inherent power within diaspora, and look, I don't think we should ever be naive. Power is still very important in the 21st century, you know, so this is a bit of a diplomatic no-brainer to do. You know, so that's why you see a lot of governments at it. One of my pet hates, you know, and this is probably and I've done this strategically during the pandemic. I took a listening role, you know, so apart from doing diaspora, this is only my second time speaking. You know, but what I was doing in a lot of those sessions was just to get a sense of where the sector is, or maybe where it's not. And what I heard again and again was that instantaneous blending of migration and diaspora. And I think that's very naive. I think if we continue down that pathway, we'll continue to do a disservice for diaspora engagement. There'll be some successes, don't get me wrong, but to get it where it can really be, I think we need to strategically decouple when applicable, as they say.
Okay, well, that sort of leads me on. I mean, you know, I think it's interesting to reflect as well, just as a very last point on that discussion topic. You know, it's interesting to reflect on the meanings of migrant and diaspora, or migration and diaspora. When we talk about migration, I mean, just the words themselves are very much about movement of people, while diaspora, of course, comes from you know, the Greek, the Greek etymology revolves around the scattered aspect of it. So I don't know. I think I find those distinctions, or those different etymologies themselves, also quite indicative of the different ways that you can use.
Completely agree. And I think what's interesting, you know, it'd be great to get your listeners' kind of feedback, either through the comments or however they want to engage. You know, and this might be the reluctant academic in me, you know, when I read academic work, I love it. You know, trust me, I get a kick out of reading it, because sometimes I don't understand the words and I get to learn something, you know. But, you know, when you go to talk to diaspora communities, then I try to put it into practice. There is a bit of that disconnect, you know, and you'll see a lot in kind of academic literature on diaspora around issues of, you know, ethno-nationalism, transnationalism. You know, when you get into the field and try to apply that and talk to diaspora communities, you know, I've spoken to many diaspora communities all over the world. I don't think any of them have told me they're a transnational migrant.
Very true.
But, you know, so I think we have to figure that out as well, you know, in a sense of, you know, you know, I read a great book recently about philanthropy, about, you know, developing giving effectively in philanthropy by Phil Buchanan for the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the US. But he talks about impact, you know, and a sense about how you can actually get best bang for your buck in terms of giving strategically and effectively. You know, some of those lessons are transferable. You know, they're not kind of just exclusive to philanthropy. And one of the things he was saying was, you know, go talk to your expected beneficiaries. You know, there's been that kind of hierarchy of power historically, you know, so I think that's a good way of looking at it in terms of, you know, that maybe academic discourse. And when you sit down to somebody that's, you know, spent 20 or 30 years of their lives, whether they're working on a building site, working for a multinational, whether they're in C-suite, whether they're a non-profit leader, you know, do they see themselves that way? I would argue, I guess, probably not, you know. So we might need to look at the, coming back to your kind of point about the words that we use and the vocabulary, we might have to come back and revisit that a bit.
Very, very good point. Very good point. And all that leads on to the next question, which is about, you know, where is the diaspora engagement sector right now, and where do you think it's going?
Look, quick news, this is the positivity. I'm actually incredibly excited. I've been quite skeptical for the last 10 years, I won't lie. But this might sound really weird, but I think COVID has reawoken diaspora. Good and bad, in the sense of the vulnerabilities they have, the issues they have. You just have to look at what's happening in the US as well. Those issues are there for centuries. They're not there for decades. So I think what you're seeing now is the way I've been trying to frame it in my mind, and particularly through anything I've been doing with the Networking Institute or on the LinkedIn stuff and all that, is that we've entered a diaspora moment. And the important part here is to transition it into a diaspora movement, because we've had moments before. And those moments tend to come in moments of crisis, sadly enough, in diaspora engagement. So the financial crisis, at the moment with the pandemic. So I'm actually incredibly optimistic that a lot of the missed opportunities of the past that we spoke about in terms of backing diaspora on its own or anything like that, I think they can be met now, because I think there's more people looking at the topic. And I think there's more people with capacity and propensity to do something very meaningful for the sector looking at the topic. So that's the really good news. I think in terms of where it's going, I think it depends on where your entry point is. Are you talking about in the sense of where's it going from governments? I think you probably have seen over the last 10 years, through work of IOM, ICMPD, who have the new kind of EU diaspora facility, is it the growth of number of policies and diaspora ministries or units. So that's growing. That tells it that the sector is getting more interest. I think when you're looking at nonprofits,
is that a good thing?
It's a good thing if you're working on it. No, look, I think it's good and bad. I think we have to be very pragmatic. Most diaspora engagement fails, and there's many reasons behind that. Happy to talk to that. One of the presentations that we give that gets most interest is 25 reasons why diaspora engagement fails, rather than looking at the success story. So I think it's a difficult question. Is it good or bad? I think it has to be done. I think there's times for government where they need to know when they need to implement, and sometimes when they need to know to get out of the way. And I think that the latter is something that doesn't happen too often. So that could be an issue. So I think from a government point is going forward. I think from a non-profit point of view, I think they're the heroes of the sector, to be frank. And that's something I've been reflecting on in the pandemic. And this might be a working class background or a working class mind in my head. The question I'm asking myself is, who do we need to be backing, in a sense of diaspora engagement moving forward? And I think the pandemic has proved that the non-profits, a non-profit is a big word. It's not just your traditional charities now, it can be different type of vehicles for community welfare. I think they're the ones that have had the agility to react and move, and I think the hidden opportunity in all this will be the rise of public-private partnership in executing. I think that's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on, particularly in the US. And I apologize if my analysis is more US folks, because that's where the mind has been based for the last couple of months, particularly in the last couple of years. So that's what I see, and I think what's really important is that the diaspora nonprofit world fits into a much wider nonprofit sector. I think it's important that we keep and promote and celebrate that nonprofit, that diaspora component within it, as I said, to have confidence to stand on its own 2 feet, because I think that's where success will come from. So that might be too broad, but I'm happy to dig into either one.
Well, I wanted to pick up on one aspect of what you've just described, and that's COVID-19. The pandemic. I mean, it's something, just also to timestamp this podcast, we're speaking at the beginning of August 2020. So, we're, at least in Europe, we're more or less done with the first wave, and there's talk of a second wave. And so I wanted to just pick up on what you said and ask, especially for the purposes of those, for those listening, what kind of interesting examples have you come across of how diaspora has mobilized themselves during COVID?
Yeah, look, I think the answer has been in the charitable and nonprofit sector. I think they've worked to help each other in the sense of where they're based in the countries of destination, and not just their own diaspora members, the wider communities. You obviously have a big shift towards, telemedicine, healthcare, education, online. So there's a whole plethora of activities that I think is important. I think, there's a couple of hidden lessons that I think if we record it in August 2021, we might be talking about it. And I'll point out to one or two here. Is, most diaspora engagement from official mechanisms, whether it's government ministries, that have that apparatus, historically they've tried to just kind of, and I hate this language. I want to get this out there. I hate the language. We're going to tap them. We're going to harm them.
Yeah.
It just smacks of insincerity. So I think what's happened historically is that they've specifically targeted a certain section of their diaspora, whether that's kind of getting remittances into investment, but the high achievers. And I think what the pandemic has proven is it's arguably more important to look after your vulnerable members of your diaspora. And I think the countries that have done that well historically were in a much better position to react to the pandemic and to help their people abroad. And I think the beauty of it is that when those people go to engage with the successful members of the diaspora, they won't forget that. I've been in rooms and I've been asked questions from people that have been very, very successful. And they've asked, what are you doing for the people that have not been as successful as I have? And if you don't have a good answer, you're in trouble. So I think that has kind of proven fact in the pandemic. Here's another one, and I might be stepping on a few toes here, but we'll stand over it. I think, and look, we'll give them a little bit of a disclaimer to begin with, because when the pandemic came globally, it was almost a shock and awe, and everybody was kind of fishing around for responses. So for the first 2 months, in terms of the European perspective, and more broadly internationally, there was forums and webinars like never before. Everybody was an expert. And the interesting thing for me, I genuinely believe this. I think some of the big institutional players are so out of touch, it's unbelievable. And I think they may have been shown up a bit. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, for example, now is a bit of a movement around. Particularly, this was more migration than they asked. Let's create some youth advisory groups. Let's create some youth council groups and all this kind of stuff. You see it on a daily basis now from some big players in this sector, and I think they've learned a lesson that maybe they were a little bit too out of touch for their own good. So that could be a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. Very well said. And I think your point about the terminology, but also the meanings behind the terminology, the intentions behind the terminology is also very valid. It's really true that you see these terms like tapping into the diaspora, harnessing the diaspora, mobilizing the diaspora.
Yeah.
And it is, and I think we've come across this in some of our work together as well, in that it's of course important, in order to cultivate that trust and confidence and positive feelings between the diaspora and the country and the government. You need to do a lot of work that goes beyond just finding a few people who want to invest a lot of money.
Yeah.
Because
can we jump into something there, Loksan?
Yeah.
I think you're touching on something much bigger that I think is actually much more powerful if people really try to figure it out. When you talk about the relationship to the country, and the next word is being the government, for a lot of people in the diaspora, the country is not the government. The country is what they have in their heart. And that might sound soft, it might sound emotional, but that's the reality for a lot of communities. So what I think you're picking out there is, the distinction between a sense of nation and a sense of state. And they're two very different beasts. And I have my idea now which one I think is more powerful, and it starts with an N. So I just wanted to jump in on that, because I think when it comes to diaspora, this comes back to, we have a line that people have picked up that we say quite a bit, and we strategically say it because we know it's going to get a reaction. We say that migration is the language of borders and identity, but diaspora is the language of affinity and belonging. And if you think about sitting down with communities and people, and particularly where the world is at the moment, people are tired. People are tired of public institutions. Anything seen official is almost toxic now. And there's reasons behind that. Everything from racial inequality to wealth inequality. People feel left behind, whether you like to admit it or not. So, when you talk about getting people engaged or aligned to your vision or your mission or your purpose, whether you're a government, whether you're a nonprofit organization, whether you're a company, the more emotive, powerful language will win every day of the week at the moment, because it gives people something to believe in. So it's quite sad on one level, but it's quite important to say it.
I couldn't agree more, Martin, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there. And it's also something that resonates very strongly with my own background. I mean, when I talk about my Chineseness, I like to, on the one hand, I do have this connection with China, but I don't feel much connection, for example, to the Chinese flag. And not to get too much into it, but my Chinese side of the family was very much on the nationalist side of the Civil War many years ago. And then they subsequently fled to Hong Kong. So although Chineseness and China has always been quite present in my life growing up, and then when, from living there for several years, I have a lot of affection for the country and its people, the flag is still quite political to me and is quite loaded with a lot of different meanings. So I think if we can use that play on nations and belonging and affinity, that's where the magic happens.
Completely agree. Incredibly well said.
Yeah. Okay. And moving on to something else. I mean, I often half jokingly refer to you as Mr. Diaspora, among other things, of course, but I know that, and also, I think you're known in the business as the nicest guy in the business, and perhaps the hardest to understand. So we'll see if we can put subtitles on the YouTube video. But I often refer to you as Mr. Diaspora, but I know that you work on much broader themes of philanthropy and networking. Hence your work with the Networking Institute. I was wondering if you could describe, in your terms, the intersections between diaspora and those different topics.
Perfect. So first of all, just Mr. Diaspora stuff. 2 quick comments on that. I have to be careful how I phrase this, but it sounds like a dodgy male beauty pageant somewhere. Mr. Diaspora. And when I was starting out, somebody very close to me that was very good to me, so why don't you call yourself Dr. Diaspora? And he was using the analogy of, I don't know if you're familiar with the cleaning product Mr. Clean.
I'm not, but yeah.
You can brand it everywhere, but look, believe it or not, Loksan, my passion in the diaspora world more broadly is philanthropy. It's something that I strongly believe in, and what we have to be cognizant of when we talk about diaspora philanthropy. I remember being at a conference in California at the start of the year, and I'm incredibly lucky to sit on a couple of kind of executive leadership councils and boards for the likes of the African Diaspora Network and Ireland Reaching Out. And I remember at the ADN event, somebody came up to me and said, everybody's been trying the diaspora philanthropy piece, but no one's really cracked it. Well, the Irish have, in many ways. But we have to really dig into what that means as well, and that's the boring academic in me in terms of what we mean, and that's where the article came about. And the linkages between networking, philanthropy, and diaspora is in the first one, networking. To do philanthropy well, to do diaspora well, it's about building networks, and traditionally networks of affluence and influence. And there's a whole process that goes into that. And the power of networking has probably never been seen to greater impact than it has over the last couple of months, or it will be seen in the next couple of months as job losses become more prevalent. One of the things that I respect and admire greatly from your story, and I've said this from the beginning that we met, is that you had the courage quite young in your career to see the opportunity of what you wanted to do as an independent consultant to go after it. Not many people make that decision, and a lot of those people might be out of a job in the next couple of months. So your network will give you your next job. So that's rant over. Let's get back to the question. What we found particularly when I began to do the research on the peace process. So the PhD itself, for example, had kind of 3 to 4 key chapters. One on obviously the history of the conflict, one looking at diaspora media, one looking at diaspora philanthropy, and the other looking at diaspora politics. and how those three components as strategies actually co-aligned to bring the Irish diaspora piece in the US particularly to influence the US government to get involved, lobbying with the British government then and the Irish governments. And what I quickly realized in that research was that it was about creating little clusters of networks of affluence and influence. So this is a bit of a myth of diaspora engagement. When people say that we have 2 million in our diaspora, we want to engage our diaspora, the right 10 people in your diaspora can change your country. So the question is, how do you get to them? So they're the linkages that you see coming through. And look, we've built out processes kind of through that, and what I found was that these key people within the diaspora became what we call nudge factors or tipping agents. So let's do a little exercise for people. There might be people listening to this that are saying they're working for a government ministry, or they're working for an international agency or an investment firm that are saying we want to engage the diaspora to invest back in. It's very difficult to get your diaspora to give you their money. Historically, it's always been difficult. What they don't tend to mind doing is giving you the money of the people they work for. So, what the Irish copped on quite quickly, for example, in terms of FDI and diaspora direct investment, was that it was the advocacy role that the Irish diaspora at the C-suite level could play. That if it was a 50-50 decision, they would tip the decision 51-49 in the case of Ireland. Now, we have many of those stories, but we don't have them in a log that we can tell you, but we know them anecdotally. You just have to believe that this works, and not just the tipping agents or the nudge factor. It's important then that how you engage them is incredibly tailored to those individuals, because they're different. They have limited time if they're successful. They have interests that you need to know about. So that's where the process comes back in. And more broadly, it's the 4-step process. Research, who are your diaspora, where are your diaspora, what are they doing? But within that, you have to, it might sound crazy, but you have to figure out your capacity and propensity to work with you or your country or whatever your end game is. So the second phase is cultivation. And the number one skill in diaspora engagement, as it is with philanthropy and as it is with networking, I would argue, is listening. You've got to be a world-class listener to do this well. So get comfortable listening. That gets you to learn about the other person. Solicitation is obviously the ask, and the most important phase is arguably stewardship, which is to look after them. If you can convince a diaspora member to give to you, retain them. The number one reason why anybody leaves a product and service is that they feel taken for granted. So if you've done all the hard work of getting them to engage, it's absolute folly to let them go. And I think that's where, believe it or not, topics that we began with of sincerity, authenticity, come back into play. And people that do this well are incredibly authentic. So that was a long answer, but for me, I genuinely believe that the future of the sector is in diaspora philanthropy, because here's the punchline: diasporas engage because they care. That's the first entry point. And I think philanthropy is one of those types of engagement that can be an incredible portal to whether you want to work towards economic development or skills transfer or whatever it is. And it will bring you into contact with people that will not just be able to help the country back home, but help their fellow people that are living abroad.
Fascinating stuff, Martin. And just for those who are interested in learning a bit more about networking and philanthropy and the work that you've been doing, we'll leave a link to the Networking Institute's website in the show notes. Now, I wanted to ask you another question about Ireland, because it's something that you talk about sometimes. You often vaunt the successes of the Irish model of diaspora engagement, and so for those who are perhaps not so familiar with diaspora engagement and what Ireland has done, could you perhaps give an overview of the unique aspects of the Irish model of diaspora engagement, and also and you can also talk about other strong models that you've come across, and also if you could highlight what aspects of these models could be replicated by other countries.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to speak to kind of 2 or 3. Look, I'm an incredibly proud Irishman, so I only talk about Ireland every day. But look, I want to start with a really simple message, but I think it's really important. Diaspora engagement in the Irish context historically has happened for centuries. You know, if you want to go back to writing letters and different types of correspondence, you know, and it's quite an emotional topic in Ireland, being a very small island next to a cranky neighbour at the moment. You know, historically, when a lot of people left Ireland, it was a wake. You know, they would never see their family member again, you know, whether they were going west or, you know. So historically, it's always happened. But I think at an institutional level, if the people listening to this are more working for institutions and so on and so forth, we're still quite young in terms of diaspora engagement in Ireland. So the first Irish Abroad unit was only set up in 2004, which is not that long ago, you know, and what they've done in that space of time is nothing short of amazing, you know. So I'll shamelessly sell Ireland with 2 or 3 messages. One of the things that the Irish government knows what to do is to get out of the way, that I mentioned earlier, you know. So they have an incredible policy instrument called the Emigrant Support Program, which is a fund that Irish diaspora organizations all over the world can apply into. And these organizations are now include business networks and so on, and everything that's more progressive about Ireland, including everything such as, you know, we had a referendum not too long ago on same-sex marriage that the Irish diaspora organizations were kind of big supporters of. But they also support organizations that are helping Irish people that are struggling with substance abuse, prisoners, mental health, you know, those people that are undocumented in the US. So the government that has the back of the vulnerable members of the diaspora, but they do it through partnership. So you have this public-private partnership model that I spoke about. I think the successful and vulnerable is important. And to steal a quote from, or a JFK-esque quote, you know, what the Irish government have done incredibly well is to, you know, ask what they can do for the diaspora, not what the diaspora can do for them. And I think by
JFK also being a prominent member of the Irish diaspora as well.
It was actually, look, in many historical books, it was the culmination of the Irish diaspora story in the US, you know, JFK becoming president. So, you know, give before you get, I think is an important lesson within it. I think what they do as well is, you know, I mentioned what we did in FDI and so on and so forth, but we do it through fun, believe it or not. You know, we make this stuff fun. That might sound so simple, but, you know, if they want to celebrate Irish culture, music, arts, storytelling, you know, GAA, the sport, it's just, we've done it in a way that is very cultural in its fabric. I think we need to do more to build a structure around that, don't get me wrong, but I think that's the positivity of it. In terms of other countries to look at, you know, we mentioned listening. I think India is fascinating. You know, India again began this realistically at the turn of the century. They created a kind of high-level committee for the Indian overseas, and they went out and listened to them, you know, and they were told some tough things. You know, they were told maybe you're a little bit corrupt, you know, a little bit bureaucratic, and they went back. But within 15 years, 20 years, you know, you had Prime Minister Modi selling out Madison Square Garden, Wembley Stadium, you know, cultural events, but trade and investment behind the scenes in terms of the Make in India program. China have done incredible stuff, particularly in terms of FDI. And look, historically, a lot of people shy away from because of different reasons, but Israel has been the leader in diaspora engagement for many, many years, you know, and they have some incredible programs that have been replicated all over the world, particularly Taglit, the Taglit Birthright program. So the one thing I would say, it's a great question in terms of the lessons and the models, because diaspora engagement is ironically non-competitive. You know, you'll want to help China, I want to help Ireland, you know. So we can actually look at each other's countries, and Kingsley and I have a phrase that we're kind of famous for, that we're founding members of a group called CASE, and K stands for copy and steal everything. You know, so if we can look at India, we can look at China, we can look at Israel, we can look across Africa now, with countries that are beginning to emerge on the topic. We can look at the Caribbean, you know, we can look across Southeast Asia that are looking at this. And I think that globality of the topic is partly its power, as I said earlier, it's about people as well. But the ideas can be taken and adopted to the local context. It's not a plug and play. It has to be adopted, but, you know, thematically or structurally, you can look at things that have worked and say to yourself, you know, that may work here.
Those are some fantastic points, Martin. And yeah, I hadn't reflected on it too much before, but it does all come down to some of these broader themes that we've already touched on. You know, not just trying to tap into the diaspora, but also seeing what you as a country can do for the diaspora. And then also playing on this, you know, these feelings of belonging which are there, and that's something which I also wanted to ask. I mean, Ireland's been so successful with this with its PR strategy of making people, anyone who wants to feel Irish, be recognized in some way as Irish. And then somehow that leads them to go to Ireland, look up their family history, spend loads of money in your hotels and pubs, and bring multinational companies to invest in Silicon Docks. So, how did you do that? How did Ireland do that? How did you? I mean, it's also the same question. How did Greece make Tom Hanks feel like he's part of the diaspora? How did Ireland make Martin Sheen feel part of the Irish diaspora?
There's a couple of. I could give you a flippant answer, but I won't.
I'm also asking because Britain has been so bad at.
Let's come back to the Britain question, because it's something that we were involved in a couple of years ago around. It was then UK Trade and Investment, but I think it's DIT now, is it Department of International Trade?
Yeah.
Look, there's a couple of some very simple answers in many ways. We're very lucky in Ireland to have really good people working for the agencies, particularly the semi-state agencies that promote this type of stuff. So the diaspora is a very small cog in the wheel. You also have, some people would say a very competitive corporate tax rate. You have good infrastructure. You have excellent education. You have workforce on tap, hopefully now. So our competitiveness should always be there. So the diaspora piece is one piece of it.
Proximity to Great Britain.
Yeah, to fly over it, right? But so look, I think there's an old saying in business and any walk of life: hire talented people and pay them well, and things tend to look after themselves. So we've done that quite well in many different ways. I think also, coming back to the branding point of it, we do very much play up to the fact of that power of affinity to the island. And I want to say the word the island. We mentioned earlier the poignancy of having the conversation today with John Ewan passing. We've had some rip-roaring failures on this island on diaspora engagement, and we're happy to admit that, and we're happy to share that. But what we can do now as an island to what we could do 30 years ago is fundamentally different, and we have to acknowledge the people that have laid the foundations for us to do that. So look, I think part of it is, if it is from a government perspective in terms of your audience and kind of your working base, you have to put diaspora engagement front and center of your foreign policy. And that cuts across everything from not just cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy, but commercial diplomacy. And diaspora engagement in the sense of FDI and how we have done it. I can tell you stories of, I won't mention the agency, but back in the 80s, for example, they had researchers in there, probably interns, creating lists of people sitting on boards in America that had an Irish-looking surname. And diaspora engagement is the business of lists. It always has been and always will be. So you need to build that out. You need to then, trust people that can engage. And when you talk about, FDI coming in and multinationals coming in, that's the tipping agent piece that I talk about. That's not an Irish-American person signing a check in their own name. That's an Irish-American person signing historically in the likes of Coca-Cola, Bank of America. Nowadays, it might be Google, it might be Facebook. So, and like anything, the first one is always the most important. One of the early FDI investments in Ireland, the story goes, I assume it's true because I've heard it from many different people, is that at the time they were looking for computer scientists to fill the jobs. They had made the decision to come to Ireland, but we didn't have the people. So the agency involved said, we do have the people, but they've emigrated. And they gave them a list of those people. And the company went out and approached them and hired a good bunch of them to come home, So there were different times. Nowadays, people might want to stay abroad, And but look, that's part of it. I kind of waffled a bit there, but what I would say it's a small cog in a big wheel. But we have a feeling in Ireland that not a feeling, the saying that if you feel Irish, you are Irish. And I think in today's world is incredibly important. And just to finish on the foreign policy point, Ireland's most recent foreign policy document. Our vision is to be an island at the center of the world, led by our values. I can't think of many other countries talking that way at the moment, particularly our neighbours on either side.
Fair point. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I'm also, the last question is really me sending you back a question that you
Yes,
asked
yes.
me a couple of weeks ago, and that is, could you give us 2 predictions for the future? One about Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, to which many may already know we have a shared affiliation, and another about diaspora engagement and the sector, broad, in broad terms.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of Tottenham, the first prediction I can make is that my therapy bills are going to go up. Look, hopefully, first and foremost, hopefully fans get back in. I think it's important, and ironically enough, look, with these things, you make friends for life through these connections. So I have a good few friends in the UK who'll probably be listening to this and say, "What does he actually do?" And they'll probably say I'm still full of something else. But look, I think we need a little bit of restructuring, a little bit of rebuilding. The guy in charge wasn't the most popular appointment, but I think if we give him a bit of cash and a bit of support, we might finally get something in the trophy cabinet.
That was a much more detailed answer than I was expecting, actually. But,
yeah,
yeah, good for the fans out there.
Yeah. So look, I think in terms of the sector more broadly, I kind of touched on it earlier. I'm incredibly optimistic, and I'm incredibly hopeful for the future. And part of the reason for that is everything that we talked about. The movements that are popping up. Despite the horrificness of the pandemic, I think there has been a quiet swelling of interest in the topic. So I was trying to think of, what is an idea. For me, I think diaspora philanthropy will explode, particularly at the high end. I think if you look at trends of giving, particularly in the US again, giving at the middle and the lower end is actually declining for the first time in history over the last couple of years. Steadying a bit because of the pandemic, but I think once pressure comes in terms of job losses and everything like that, that's going to go down. So a lot of people argue good and bad for that, in the sense of the concentration of wealth. That's a very open debate to be having, because I think it's important to have it. But I think you're going to see something quite magical in terms of diaspora philanthropy at the top end. So that's one thing I would say to keep an eye on. Coming back to the entry point maybe of the role of government, where I see it is almost a harmonization of the traditional role of embassies and consulates and wider diaspora in engagement or diaspora diplomacy. One of the things I've always been trying to figure out over the last couple of years is, and this is true for the Irish government as it is for the government of Lesotho, what type of talent are you hiring in and around your diplomatic corps? I think it's important to really think strategically about that at the moment. So I think you're going to see, for want of a better phrase, almost embassies and consulates becoming diaspora houses, where economic development will come back in and trade and investment and everything like that. So I think they're the kind of two things that stick in my mind. I think what we've seen over the last while has been something that we should have been admitting for quite a while, is that the heroes of this space are, the nonprofit leaders and the people that stick their neck on the line on a day-to-day basis to do this. So when people ask me, who should I be looking out for in the sector, the people I mentioned are Melek Pulakonak, who runs Turkish Women's International Network, Almas Nagash, who runs African Diaspora Network, different people like Germin, and moving from there, in Albania and Kosovo, Ireland reaching out, Mike Ferrick and Laura Colleran, these are the people that are really, getting their hands dirty on the front lines. And I think if we find a way of getting, and I can't take credit for this phrase, but in the true spirit of copy and stealing everything, there's a chap, Hilmi Gashi, who sits on the board of Germin, or I don't know if he still does, but he used to sit on the board of Germin. And he said, we need to go from a pioneering organization to a professional one. And I think that's a really clever way of looking at the diaspora nonprofit world. I think what we'll see over the next while is the opportunity to make that step. So there are the 3 or 4 key trends I would keep an eye on. Happy to be given out to if anybody disagrees with them. Hopefully we'll have a trophy at that.
No, those are really excellent predictions. So I guess big diaspora philanthropy to explode, hopefully that professionalization of the non-profit sector, and a solid rebuilding for Tottenham Hotspur.
Yeah. I mean, just to echo something, I think it's important to say, and one of the reasons why I'm delighted to do this, and I commend you on having the courage for it, we need to give young people a voice in this game. What I've seen during the pandemic, particularly in the early stages with the forums.
You're not that young anymore, Martin.
I'm getting there. But I genuinely think that that's important, and that might be that when I was talking earlier about maybe being a bit out of touch, I think that's what I was hinting at there. And I think, look, big organizations have incredibly talented young people working for them. What I would say to them is trust them, let them loose. What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, great. And last but not least, I mean, how can people connect with you, get in touch with you?
Yeah, of course. Look, we're on LinkedIn, but social media myself are not good bedfellows, as they say. So look, through the Networking Institute website is probably the best way. You can reach us through the company, or just Martin at thenetworkinginstitute.com.
Fantastic. Martin, it was really great speaking with you, and I enjoyed the banter. I enjoyed the discussions. You're doing such great work, and well, both you and the folks at the Networking Institute. So, keep up the good work, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening.
Thank you, and thank you for your time, buddy. Have a good one.
Okay, thank you.